Hi, my name is Sarah Morant. My pen name is SG Morant, and a lot of my videos I talk about the Harvard Classics collection because I'm currently going through and reading those. But this week is going to be a little different. I'm going to talk about the Metamorphosis by Ovid because I just recently finished this monster of a book and I need to talk about it. So, if my voice sounds a little funny, by the way, I've been sick, and that's why I didn't get a video out last week, is because I was super sick and didn't have time to film one. But I have been dying to talk about this book. So, The Metamorphosis by Ovid is kind of a compilation of a lot of Greek mythology stories. And it's really a great starting, not a starting place necessarily. I would recommend reading something by Homer as a starting place into Greek mythology, whether that be the Iliad or the Odyssey, or honestly, I would recommend reading the Odyssey as your very first Greek mythology book, and then go back and read the Iliad and then the Aeneid. And then this one is great. Or if you want something really easy, you could read one of the plays like Antigone or Oedipus Rex or something along those lines. But Ovid is one of the first branching out Greek mythology books that I've ever read. I guess it kind of is the first. I mean, I've read kind of the traditional canon of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, and then I've read Oedipus Rex and Antigone. But this was the first book that I actually picked up that was like, okay, I really am interested in Greek mythology and I want to learn more, and I want to read something that's not like a high school or college required read. And a lot of those other ones were that for me, except for the Iliad and the Aeneid. All the other ones I read for school. And so I was doing some research because I finished reading the Iliad, and I was like, this is it? It honestly feels like you don't get the whole story when you finish the Iliad. You end up with, like, I think Hector is killed at the end, and but Achilles is still alive. Troy is still, like, the fight is still happening. They haven't done the Trojan horse. None of that happened yet. And so because of ending with that, I was like, I need to learn more. And so I did some research and I was like, okay, where can I find these myths that we know of from Greek mythology? Where can I read about them? Because a lot of the books I've read so far, the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Aeneid, don't really fully cover it. Like, they reference it sometimes, but they don't go into what those myths are. I just moved my camera because it was driving me crazy. But anyway, so I was doing some research into where I could learn about these myths that I like Icarus and just along those lines, those type of myths, the Minotaur, things like that I know of from Greek mythology, from like the just all culture has a lot of that type of stuff in it, but that I haven't read in a Greek mythology story before. And in doing that research, I learned about the Metamorphosis by Ovid, which is kind of a compilation of a lot of those stories. And it was a lot more than I expected. I mean, it covers a lot of stories. There are some that I'm still not sure where I can read about them from, and especially like Achilles, and like, where did the idea of the Achilles heel come from? Because as far as I can tell, that is not him bathing in the river Styx and gaining this invulnerability in battle. As far as I can tell, that's not really a concept that's explored in the original myths, and that it's more his armor that his mother got for him from Vulcan or Hephaestus is what was kind of the invulnerability aspect. So I'm still looking to find more of like the Trojan War era stuff because that really interests me, and I have not found a definitive guide for like where I can read about the full Trojan War story. So I'm still looking into that. But the Metamorphosis answered a lot of my other Greek mythology questions and introduced me kind of as a new reader of Greek mythology to all of these myths that I was looking to learn more about. And I think that's the beauty of the Metamorphosis, is that it's very reader friendly. It's very it's like a collection of short stories, and so that's probably the reason why it took me so long. And all of the stories are interconnected, and there's this chronological side of it where it goes from like the beginning of history all the way up to the time of Ovid's own life and the Roman Empire and that type of thing. And it even like deals with the death of Caesar and things like that that are more modern to the author who wrote the book. And so it gives the reader a broad look at Greek mythology and gives you kind of a chronological order and talks about certain aspects of the myths. However, Ovid, I believe, in the case of this book, did not, he drew these myths from a lot of different places, and then he kind of shaped them to fit his story. Because the Metamorphosis is a story of metamorphosis, change. And so a common theme throughout the story is that a change occurs. And usually that's like a physical transformation of the characters. Sometimes it's a mental transformation, sometimes it's a change of place, things like that. But most of the time it's a physical transformation. And he especially had a fondness for turning people into birds or trees. That's like almost all of the transformations are birds or trees, which I thought was kind of funny because I go into reading something called the Metamorphosis and I was like, oh, we're going to have a lot of different kinds of transformations. No, for the most part, it's birds and then trees. There are a few others, like there's a jaguar, there's a dog, there's water. Somebody's transformed into like a pond or a river or something like that. Stuff like that happens a lot too, but for the most part, birds and trees. And like you can see on the cover here, this is from the story Daphne and Apollo. And this is Apollo chasing Daphne, and then she turns into a tree, which becomes, whose leaves become the laurels that, like Olympians and stuff wore during that time. And became kind of a symbol of Apollo. And so, definitely trees are a big theme in here, and I'm not entirely sure why. But it's very interesting. Something that was really cool about the Metamorphosis is that it gave me a better view of like what Greek mythology is. I am a Percy Jackson kid. I grew up with the Percy Jackson books. I loved them. That's what kind of got me started with being interested in Greek mythology. And then later on I read the Odyssey, and at first I hated it because I hated Odysseus. And then I kind of just recently have had kind of a reawakening of liking Greek mythology, and that's because of Epic the Musical. That's music that this guy created based on the Odyssey that made me actually enjoy the story of the Odyssey and feel a sense of empathy towards Odysseus that I never had before. And so that kind of reinstated this love of Greek mythology in me and encouraged me to read the Iliad and the Aeneid, and then now Metamorphosis. And I still have a few others on my list that I want to read eventually, but the Metamorphosis definitely gave me a great starting point and allowed me to decide what myths I would like to learn more about. And which ones I'm kind of like, yeah, that's enough information. I don't really need to know anything more about that. So that being said, Ovid, who wrote the Metamorphosis, was, he was known for writing several different groups of myths. He wrote one, a tragedy called Medea. He wrote Fasti, which is calendar, and a few others, I believe, and some of them are still around and accessible, and some of them have been kind of lost to history. But the Metamorphosis is kind of his most wide-ranging work for sure, and definitely his most, it's very impressive. It goes from like all of history up to his life, and that's something that is quite the undertaking that he accomplished. And Metamorphosis is also one of his more well-known, probably his best well-known work. Ovid was banished from Rome, and he lived an interesting life, and he was like exiled and then died in his late 50s. So he was kind of an interesting character. I'm not gonna get super into that in this video because I feel like that's a whole separate thing. But he kind of grew up in this tumultuous time in Roman history. And like he was born soon after the death of, not long after the death of Caesar. And so that was definitely a trying time of history, and a lot was happening, and that kind of influenced his work and his being like imprisoned and banished. So that is definitely very interesting about him. So as I was reading this, I annotated it, which I'm very glad I did because this is a beast of a book, and I may want to reference it later, and I'm going to have very hard times finding what I need out of it if I don't have some way of locating things. So my annotations for this book include the dark blue is transformation, which I decided to add because it's kind of the common unifying theme of the book. And I ended up not having that many tabs because every single story ends in transformation, and I decided it probably wasn't a good idea to just do a transformation tab every single time a transformation took place. And so I ended up not really using that super often. I used it for the ones that really stuck out to me, but for the most part, the transformations, like I said, were birds or trees, and they weren't like super unique or engaging, in my opinion. And they're important to the story, but I didn't feel the need to annotate them. The second annotation I had was for hubris / grief, because I was originally going to do hubris, and then I realized it wasn't that much of a recurring theme throughout the stories. And then also, it was closely related, usually, to the topic of grief, which was a much more common theme throughout the book. So I was able to have those tabs. That also did not get a whole lot of use, but it was nice to have that where I could go back and see the very poignant parts of the book. And then the yellow tab, which I found the most helpful to have looking back, was specifically for origin of mythology themes. So anytime there was a myth that I was familiar with, or a subject from Greek mythology that I was familiar with, largely thanks to Percy Jackson, that I was like, yeah, this is something that is very interesting to me, and I want to be able to go back and find it later. I used one of these yellow tabs, and so like I have one here that is the origin of the lore symbol, and I have the origin of like Bacchus's grapevines and dolphins, because that's really random and it just stuck out to me. And then Medusa and things like that. And so I use this to highlight the sections that deal with some of the more common Greek myths that I definitely was interested in and probably would want to find again later. And then I had a tab for romance, which was interesting because going into this, I wasn't really sure what to expect. And I should have anticipated the very problematic aspects of Greek mythology when I added that tab, because a lot of the romances that we actually kind of romanticize in our culture, like Hades and Persephone, and a few others, Orpheus and Eurydice, those type of myths, a lot of times kind of were a little distorted in all cultural today. They're not exactly how it happened. And a lot of times in the Greek mythology, the original mythology, it was actually kind of disturbing or gross or both. And it's not something I would consider romance. It's something that I would consider one person, one god taking advantage of a person, another person. And so that was definitely a lot of the stories that I was anticipating to mark as like romance ended up not being very romantic. And there was still some that I definitely used that tab for. And I largely tabbed sections that were like quotes and stuff that I found to fit that category, that maybe in like the broad aspect of the story was kind of skewed and not super romantic, but the quote itself was very like poetically romantic and something that I wanted to save to be able to go back and look at later. And then the last tab I had, which I ended up using quite often because it's kind of a catch-all category, is poetic. And that allowed me to just say, I really like this phrase, I want to highlight this, and that's usually what I do with annotated books. And there's not really a specific category, it just sounds cool. And so those ended up in the poetic category, which was very useful to have and used very often. Then if you see, I also have like these sticky notes that I kind of tore and made into tabs. Those are for my own personal use, as I am currently working on a writing project that takes some themes and stuff from Greek mythology. And as I was finding myths and sections in this book that I wanted to be able to use for that story, I would tab them, but I wanted to know specifically, just at a glance, what ones were meant for that story, as opposed to just one of these normal tabs. And so I used this tab that really like sticks out and is easy to find. And probably later when I write that story, finish that story and stuff, and I'm done with it, I will probably just remove these real easily so that I have the nicely tabbed book. So, and that's how I tabbed it and annotated it. I did not do a lot of writing on the inside of it like I normally would with annotated books. They were just, I had a few where I wrote like, explain the origin, explain what the myth was or something like that. But I didn't really feel the need to add a lot of notes, and I just wasn't really in the mood to do that with this book. But I did not highlight. I underlined sections because I just didn't really want to try to figure out the highlighter situation. I wanted something that was easy to, a little more like user-friendly to travel with, because I was very busy and I didn't want to go into this like really intricate process of annotating this book. I just wanted to know what sections I wanted to go back to later. With all of that long drawn out explanation, now I'm going to read a few quotes that I enjoyed from this book. The first one I have is in the Metamorphosis topic, and that is, thus clay, so lately no more than a crude and formless substance, was metamorphosed to assume the strange new figure of man. I just kind of bookmarked that because it reminded me of the Genesis creation story from the Bible, and I thought that was interesting, that that's also how the Greeks explain the creation of man, because I did not know that was an aspect of Greek mythology, so now I know. And then the first myth that I pockmarked as mythology in my book was Daphne and Apollo, which, although it's like tragic and it's kind of a little disturbing, like Apollo is a total creep, I still found it very interesting, and one of the more enjoyable stories in the book for me. And so I underlined the section about the lore As I with my hair that is never cut am eternally youthful, so you with your evergreen leaves offer glory and praise everlasting. And so that's what Apollo is saying to the tree that used to be Daphne. And then a poetic section. This was about the hero Cadmus, and I am not remembering a whole lot all that he did, but I found this one line in the story very poetic. To shield his body, he donned the skin of a lion. For weapons, he took his iron-tipped spear, his javelin, and more important than all, the courage to wield them. I just thought that was a cool line. I liked that. And another poetic one was, wait for the final day. Call no man happy until he's dead and his body is laid to rest in the grave. I think that's definitely a common thing in Greek mythology, at least, is that somebody will be living a good life and everything is going great and they think they're like set, nothing bad is gonna happen to them, and then something does. And so this line is like, don't call somebody happy until they're dead and you can look back at their entire life and nothing has happened. Another myth that I really enjoyed that I thought was kind of cool is the origin of Diana, or Artemis's stag. And I just really liked that story. It's like a hunt and it's very exciting. And so I highlighted that I can come back and read it later. One of the more romantic sections that I did end up highlighting was the story of Pyramus and Thisbe. And one of the lines I highlighted was, but feelings may not be forbidden. Their hearts belong to each other and bond with an equal passion. No one was in their confidence, nods and gestures the only means of conversing. The closer their secret, the stronger the flame. And so these two lovers are separated by their fathers who opposed the match, and it's pretty much saying, the match can be opposed, but the feelings are gonna remain, which I thought was an actual case of romance that was not super disturbing within the Metamorphosis. Another section that I had came from the same story, and Thisbe is talking once Pyramus has killed herself because of their ill-fated match. Thisbe says, not even death shall be able to part us. And then, obviously, yeah. And then it goes on to say, and you, O tree, whose branches already are casting their shadows on one poor body, and soon will be overshadowing two, preserve the marks of our death. Let your fruit forever be dark as a token of mourning, a monument marking the blood of two lovers. Pyramus, he died. Yeah, and then Thisbe was talking to Pyramus. Some of the names in Greek mythology could be female or male names, and so it's a little confusing when I'm just going back and looking back at them. But anyway, I think one of the things that this story kind of caught my eye was that it was very close to Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare, and so I think that was kind of the main reason why that story stuck out to me, is I feel like that was probably where Shakespeare got his idea for Romeo and Juliet from. Then another mythology story that I marked was the story of Medusa, because it's a very important one throughout Greek mythology. And another section was Perseus, which I found very interesting, and I would like to learn more about Perseus as a character, because I feel like this only scratched surface, only covered certain things, and it left out a lot of his earlier heroic actions. And one line that I highlighted as poetic throughout this was Perseus is getting married, and there's this wedding feast banquet, and it says, a banquet that suddenly turns to a brawl might well be compared to a calm sea rudely disturbed by a violent howling gale, which has made it exceedingly rough and lashed the waves to a fury. So I liked that. That was kind of poetic and cool. Another myth that I think everybody is probably familiar with is Hades and Persephone, or Pluto and Proserpina. And although the story of Pluto and Proserpina definitely starts out pretty rough, there are some aspects of it that were pretty cool and I liked and wanted to save for later. So on the mythology aspect, I highlighted this quote. The girl had already broken her fast. While taking an innocent stroll in the orchard, she'd plucked a crimson fruit from a hanging bough. Then peeling off the yellowish rind, she had picked out 7 pomegranate seeds and crushed them between her teeth. So pretty much during the story of Hades and Proserpina, or Pluto and Proserpina, I'm just going to use the Greek terms, honestly. Persephone's mother, Demeter, goes to Zeus and she's like, you have to do something about this. Hades took my daughter and I want her back. And so Zeus is like, okay, well, if she hasn't eaten anything from the underworld yet, then you can have her back. And then Persephone has already eaten the pomegranate, which obviously is one of the key symbols of that myth. And so Demeter can't have her daughter back. Eventually, Zeus, Jupiter, settles the conflict. And then the story says, Proserpina now, as the only divinity common to both realms, spends 6 months on the earth with her mother and 6 with her husband. Once she returns, her heart is so light and her face is so happy. A moment ago, she'd have struck even Pluto as sad, but now she is glowing with radiant smiles, like the sun, which was formerly hidden behind a blanket of rain clouds and then emerges victorious. And so, there's a bit of a happy ending to that story, fortunately. And maybe that's one of the reasons why it's more enduring in all culture today. And another myth that I saved was Arachne, because that was very interesting, the weave and contrast between Arachne and Minerva. Definitely a very interesting story. And as for the poetic, I saved this one from Procne and Philomela, which is kind of the story where these sisters are telling stories within that story as other stuff is happening in the background, and they take turns telling these stories of different myths. And one of the stories that I highlighted this section in because it was very poetic is, I'll cry it aloud in the marketplace, and if you still hold me prisoner deep in the forest, my words will ring through the trees. The rocks will know and be moved to pity by what I have suffered. The sky will listen, and so will the gods, if any exist there. So that was definitely kind of a cool line that I enjoyed. I also saved the story of Medea and Jason, Jason and the Argonauts, because that's very interesting. And I'll be looking for a better source of that entire, epic saga, because I would like to learn more about that. And then one of the most interesting stories from the Metamorphosis, I think, and one of the more interesting stories in Greek mythology in general, is Daedalus and Icarus. And so I saved the section of Icarus. And one line that stuck out to me was when he is falling. It says, when all this adventurous flying went to Icarus's head, he ceased to follow his leader. He had fallen in love with the sky and soared up higher and higher. The scorching rays of the sun grew closer and softened the fragrant wax which fastened his plumage. So I saved that under the section of grief and hubris, because a lot of the reason behind the myth is that Icarus was filled with hubris. He was kind of prideful and he was like, I can fly higher, I'll be fine. And obviously he was not fine, and that's why we have the phrase, don't fly too close to the sun. But what's also interesting about this myth is you also can't fly too low towards the water, because Daedalus warns Icarus that if he flies too low, the water will come up and wash away the wax as well. So you kind of have to have this middle ground, and you can't go too high, but you can't put your expectations too low either. And in the story of Meleager and the Caledonian Boar, which that was a story in this book that sounds very exciting. One of the places that I marked as grief. Vengeance is mine by sin, and death is atoned for by death. Crime must needs be added to crime, and a body to bodies. Perish the guilt-cursed house, and sorrow heaped upon sorrow. So that's kind of like the seeking vengeance, and it just was kind of poetic in a grief-filled way. Then we come to the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which I marked because that was a very interesting, important story in Greek mythology. And I marked this section. I, Orpheus, implore you, unravel the web of my dear Eurydice's early passing. We all are destined for you. We may tarry a little, but sooner or later we speed to our one habitation. This is the place that we all are bound for, our final dwelling, and yours is the longest reign that the human race must endure. So that's Orpheus talking to Pluto, urging him to give him Eurydice back. And what happened in the story is Orpheus and Eurydice were married, and like right after they were married, she was bitten on the heel, of course, because it's Greek mythology, and apparently the heel is a very common theme of death. She was bitten on the heel by this poisonous snake, and so she died, and Orpheus journeys to the underworld to bring her back. And as he's taking her out of the underworld, Hades is like, okay, you can do it, but don't look back at her. If you look back, she will die a second time. And Orpheus is so worried about her and getting her out of the underworld that he does end up looking back. And when that happens, it says, and now, as she died for the second time, she never complained that her husband had failed her. What could she complain of except that he'd loved her? So that was sad. And then it does have a bit of a happy ending eventually, though. Orpheus lives out his remaining years, and there's some issues, and he is filled with grief. And then eventually he dies, and that kind of is the happy ending to the story, because it says, as he searched the Elysian fields, he found the wife he had lost and held her close in his arms. At last the lovers could stroll together side by side, or she went ahead and he followed. Then Orpheus ventured in front and knew he could now look back on his own Eurydice safely. And so, sometimes there's happy endings, I guess, even if the happy ending comes through death. And that's kind of a common theme throughout Greek mythology. Sometimes that is how the hero gets their happy ending. And we have the death of Achilles, which they do talk about a little bit. It says, saying he pointed the hero out, still hacking the Trojans down. Then turning Paris' bow in the same direction, he guided an arrow with deadly aim at Achilles' heel. So Achilles, who'd vanquished the mightiest heroes, was vanquished himself by a coward who'd stolen the wife of his Greek host. So Paris is like Apollo is kind of taking over Paris and directing his arrow to kill Achilles. Hero of all the Trojans, the pride and bulwark of Greece's name, Achilles, the hero unequaled in battle, had ended in flames. So that's kind of what we get of Achilles. There's not a whole lot in here about his death, and there's nothing about him being struck in the ankle that is. It says that there was deadly aim in Achilles' heel, which is kind of strange because if you got shot in the heel, it should not kill you. So I guess maybe that's the hint there, or it's that's like a chink in the armor that Paris can get his arrow through. I'm not sure exactly, so I definitely am going to be looking more into the story of Achilles and how that invulnerability came to be portrayed. After Achilles dies, we get this not wrestling match. We get this like verbal match of wits between Odysseus and Ajax, the Greater, and they are kind of fighting for Achilles' armor. And Odysseus says they're having like this battle of words to try to persuade the people or the generals and stuff to bestow Achilles' armor on one of them. And Odysseus says, if you call dissembling a crime, then we both dissembled, Achilles and I. If delay is a fault, then I arrived before he did. I was detained by my wife's devotion, and he by his mother's. We gave our youth to our loved ones, the rest of our lives to Greece. If I couldn't refute the charge, I would still be proud to have shared my guilt with a hero such as Achilles. So one of Ajax's insults is that Odysseus did not come to fight for the Greeks readily. He actually disguised himself as a woman so that he wouldn't have to leave his home and his wife Penelope and his newborn son, and the Greeks finally found him out and he ended up going to fight. And so Ajax is like insulting him and saying he did not come to fight right away, whereas I was there from the beginning, readily fighting, and yet you want to give the armor to him. And then after Odysseus eventually talks his way into owning Achilles' armor, Ajax is so distraught over this humiliation that he ends up killing himself. And this one line that is just that I marked with the grief section, and it was just kind of poetic. His hands were too weak to draw out the deeply embedded weapon. It was only expelled by the force of his blood, which reddened the earth, and there gave rise to a purple flower from the soft green turf, a flower which had once been born from the wound of the young Hyacinthus. Both boy and man were recalled in the letters inscribed in the petals, Ai, Ai, for a cry of lament, Ai, Ai, for the name of a hero. So Hyacinthus' story is told earlier in the book, so that's kind of a callback to that. And then another myth that I saved was the story of Romulus, who of course is one of the founders of Rome. And so I thought that was kind of important, and I wanted to be able to see it later. And then one of the last things I marked as a metamorphosis, a change, was our bodies also are constantly changing and never at rest. What we were once and we are today, we shall not be tomorrow. I definitely thought that was a cool discussion of what metamorphosis is, and that we are in the present. We can't go back to the past, and we can't go forward to the future. And so that is kind of the key of what metamorphosis is. Ovid finishes the book with his epilogue, where he's saying this work will endure forever, pretty much, which, you know, in some ways it has. It's still around today. It's still readily available. It's still in print, and people like me are still reading it, so that's pretty cool. And it's awesome that we have access to these Greek myths that in a lot of cases have been lost, the original myths. And so I'm very glad that this book has endured to this present day. I really enjoyed it. It was hard to get through because it's, you know, short stories, so you kind of can't read a ton back to back to back. But it was very helpful to kind of get an overview of Greek mythology, and I really enjoyed it. And I would definitely recommend it for anybody interested. If anybody wants to leave a comment about another source of Greek mythology that's really good, a book that I could read, I would much appreciate it, especially if it has to do with the Trojan War period, because I am definitely very interested in that and would love to learn more about that. And if you like this video, please subscribe for more videos like this, and click the like button. And I'll see you in the next one. I'll probably be talking about some fall books in the next video, and then I will be talking about the next volume of the next story in volume 3 of the Harvard Classics. So stick around for that.